So this will be a short one. So the first thing up is my disclaimers, because this is the first video on my channel. But if you're a champion who doesn't need disclaimers, skip to disclaimer number 1. I don't need to tell you that you can disagree with me. Do it right now. Second, I don't need to tell you that this is just my opinion, because I, like all of you, obviously, enjoy LARPing as someone with stupid and bad opinions. But if something I say speaks to you, if you feel it in your soul, why should it matter to you if I agree with it or I disagree with it and think it's stupid? Live your truth. I'm not gonna do like citations on the screen. I'm gonna have a doc, like a Google Doc, linked in the description. And fucking Motorola. Okay. I'm gonna have like a full transcript of everything I say, and then I'm gonna have like hyperlinks to my sources or clarifications or all that shit. My proof for as to whether God is real is as follows. 1. Jesus is God. 2. Jesus is communion. You know, the crackers and that. And therefore, because communion is real, you can just buy it on Amazon. Naturally, Jesus is therefore real, and God is therefore real. So make sure to subscribe. That's boring. Level 2. What is a god? There are a lot of things that we will call a god or God. Why? What do those things have in common? It's not something that I ever had explained to me because it's just something that seems self-evident. Like, I was raised in a monotheistic household, but I knew about the Greek gods, the Norse gods, the Egyptian gods. I was a big Rick Riordan kid, but like instead of reading Percy Jackson like a normal person, I read the Egyptian one, and then I built a pyramid out of bricks on the porch in the backyard, and I was so sad when I couldn't teleport to Giza. The like philosophy 1 understanding of like God is the classic trilogy of omnipresence, omniscience. Whenever it sees me make a fist, it thinks I want to stop the video. That's the problem here. Omnipresence, God is everywhere. Omniscience, God knows everything. Omnipotence, God can do everything. Most modern monotheists, at least theoretically, believe that all 3 of these are true of their God, but they're not true of the vast majority of ideas that we would call gods. Okay, I've turned off Motorola gesture controls, so hopefully I'm not going to keep like flailing my hands around just so that I don't accidentally pause the recording. I can just flail them around, for normal reasons. All of the evidence that remains in the ancient Hebrew texts that form now the Tanakh or the Old Testament absolutely seem to imply that the very earliest Hebrews believed that their God, the God who a large number of people now understand to be capital G God, was region locked, that he was the god of their particular corner of historical Canaan, and that when they were defeated by the Babylonian Empire and led into exile, their god could not follow them. So this is why the opening to the book of Ezekiel puts such an emphasis on the fact that Ezekiel sees a vision of God that I wasn't supposed to read. I know that there's restrictions on how old you can be when you read it for the first time. There's restrictions on how old the person guiding your study can be. There's restrictions on how many people that person is allowed to guide in study at the same time. Me and like the 22-year-old leader of my particular study group and like one other dude were like, hey, how about, I didn't say this. They said, how about we break the law today? Let's read Ezekiel. But the emphasis that book puts on the fact that Ezekiel has a vision of capital G God, and he has the most detailed vision of God himself that you'll find anywhere in the Bible this side of the book of Revelation, which draws pretty heavily on Ezekiel. I won't defend that thesis at all. And the reason why this extremely elaborate description of God comes at the point where it does is because the idea of God himself, the absolutely awe-inspiring God who is the God not just of historical Israel, but of the entire world, was novel. So novel that Ezekiel couldn't talk for days. He just sits there until God comes back and says, hey, I had a job for you, get up. Time's a wasting. There's another condition to omnipresence, which is gods that are not region locked, but gods that are time locked. This is inherent in any religion that includes gods being born or the gods dying, which is why the question, where did God come from, is generally answered by monotheists in that nothing. I have not been to seminary, I will not go to seminary, and I don't know what they tell you there, but it's a question that will generally confuse and potentially frighten your average monotheist, who at least believes in these three things. If they don't, then it's a very easy question. But I also want to draw attention to the ancient Norse myth of Ragnarok, which we have no idea how important the story of how all the old warmongering gods warred too hard because they cast out one of their own for telling them truths they didn't want to hear. They cast out his children for just looking a little weird. They punish him grievously. He's sort of, tied up, ritualistically tortured for an extremely long period of time until someone comes and gets him and he rises from the earth. And then sails a ship made of toenail clippings to destroy the gods with his now freed children, who then consume Asgard, the home of gods. And then once everyone's dead, then a new god of and he will come back to life after being stabbed with a spear. And then he can, regardless of how invested the ancient Norse were in the idea that their gods could die or would die or should die, the idea that later observers picked up the records of what they allegedly believed and completely accepted that these beings who they worshipped were their gods, in spite of the fact that, by volume, a large proportion of what survives is the story about how those gods die, proves that, the concept of God, what we mean when we say the word God, at least in English, does not consider omnipresent. There's no implication that being able to be born and then die on a permanent basis disqualifies you from godhood. So what about omniscience? Going back to Norse mythology, one of the absolute foundational myths of Odin, the thing that inspired the venerable Norse tradition of human sacrifice Wednesdays was Odin's sacrifice of himself to himself by hanging himself on a tree till he discovered, hallucinated, not clear, how to write. But he's constantly in search of more knowledge. He keeps the head of a disgraced diplomatic envoy in a well so he can ask it questions. Eyeliner is flaking off. Okay. This continues into continuously extant monotheistic religions, including Christianity, because there were several episodes. I'm gonna put the dates and the names of this assassination plot. They were trying to kill some significant political figures somewhere in Italy, I don't care where. But these were people who were very much expecting an assassination attempt. So naturally they had some fairly serious security measures in place. And on top of that, the assassin's goal was to take out two brothers at once. If there's absolutely nothing that compels these two brothers to be in the same place at the same time, or even outside their own home. But every good Catholic, like these men, would attend Mass every Sunday. So the natural, logical thing to do, from the perspective of an assassin, would simply be to kill them at Mass, naturally. And I could also get one of the boys out of the house when he was struggling with some apparently just horrifying eye infection. All things considered, one of the mercenaries who they had lined up to do this murder was totally chill with the whole prospect of taking a human life. But when he was briefed that this would be happening in a cathedral during Mass, he backed out on the assumption that God would be able to see him if he committed a murder in church, and he was down with the murder. He was not down with the murder in the eyes of God. So regardless of how important it is that a good Christian might conceive of God as an all-knowing being, that clearly is not the case among a large number and possibly a majority of historical Christians.
Did God become God when the first person realized he had to be omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent? He must have been a god before, even if he never existed.
And someone who is willing to, turn down a very important, extremely profitable assassination contract just because he's not willing to kill in a church, that's a devout Christian. If someone would never kill anyone, I mean, how much of a sacrifice is it to not kill someone in a religious space? Someone who would kill, someone who needs his blood money to pay his bills, still choosing not to commit murder simply because he's worried about the state of his immortal soul, that is devotion. They don't make them like that anymore. It's not my feet frying anymore. I mean, the first complicating factor to omnipotence is the idea that some gods don't just require the worship of humans, because that's what's right for humans to do, but require the worship of humans simply in order to live, in order to achieve their divine duties. For this, I'm going to cite the example of the historical religion of the Mexica people when they ruled the Aztec Empire. So Mexica are to the Aztec Empire as Italians are to the Roman Empire. Although the role of human sacrifice and religious observance has been exaggerated, partially because the conquistadors needed an excuse, partially because the conquistadors only succeeded because they were allied with peoples who were generally beaten into submission by the ruling Mexica. A major tool of Aztec control over the people who were very newly within the loving embrace of the Aztec Empire was to take members of that particular nation, to take their citizens, and then extremely publicly sacrifice them to their god. So there's a political dimension to these extremely theatrical, extremely public killings of generally soldiers who had fought against the Aztec Empire. But it was not just a scheduled public execution. It was a religious ceremony, and the religious justification for this was that the sun and the moon were on the side of humanity, trying to stop the sky and the stars from enveloping the earth and extinguishing all life. The sun and the moon guarded the earth from this onslaught, but the sun and the moon required a constant sacrifice of human beings and their blood in order to sustain themselves, in order to keep up this fight. Foundation on this. So in that practice, we have the fundamental assumption that the gods' ability to do their job, to do the things that they want to do, is in some way dependent on humanity's worship. Obviously, they're not all-powerful, because if they were all-powerful, they would not require anything from humanity. But here I'm going to argue that even the existence of multiple gods fundamentally implies a limitation in all the gods' power. So I'm going to prove that by recursing that to the base. I'm going to recurse this to the base case. Suppose you only have two gods, God A, God B. Tales all this time. I'm going to argue that first, the existence of more than one god, or the understanding that there exists more than one god, fundamentally implies divine specialties, the idea that one has to be a god of one thing. You can't have two gods with completely all-encompassing divine domains. It doesn't work from a logical perspective. And second, I'm going to argue that the existence, obviously you can say that the existence of a god who's the best at task X is naturally going to imply that the abilities of the other god in task X are limited intrinsically. But I can prove that rigorously, so, fuck it. I'm gonna talk.
But first, I'm gonna start with a concrete example of how specific deities limit each other's powers in a specific religion's poetic tradition. In Pan-Hellenic mythology, the god Dionysus is the son of the king of the gods, Zeus, and a human woman, Semele. Zeus tries to hide his affair with Semele from his wife Hera, but he fails. Hera wants Semele dead, but if she kills her herself, Zeus will blame her. Instead, Hera disguises herself as a human woman and convinces Semele to make Zeus to swear a binding vow to do something that Hera knows will kill her. Dionysus is born anyway. Zeus doesn't want Semele to die, but all he can do to keep her safe is to keep Hera from finding out about her, and then threaten to hurt Hera if she attacks Semele directly. Because Hera is the goddess of marriage, Zeus has to interact with her the same way that a powerful ancient Greek man would have had to interact with his wife within the strictures of ancient Greek marriage.
There's also the implication that because Hera has to trick Semele into letting Zeus kill her, that is because Hera's power is limited, in part because Zeus is her husband, and as the goddess of marriage, she incarnates in human form. Marriage as it was understood by ancient Greek people. And this is why that fucking Hera novel is dumb as shit. I have not read it, but I've read the blurb on the back, which, I mean, judge book by its cover, do it. That's what the cover is for. It's like, Hera never wanted to be just a wife. She's the goddess of marriage. She's the goddess of wives. She's not. Don't you pull this fucking Sheryl Sandberg, lean in. If you're just gonna flatten them into things that you already understand and that already make sense to you and just seem right, you're fundamentally missing out on the, interest, value of studying distinct cultures, distinct faiths. It's because they see things differently. It's because the religion is an incarnation, it's a summation, it's a sample of how different those people were from you. This is also why I hate the Song of Achilles. To get back on topic, Zeus versus Hera implies that both of them, even Zeus, king of the gods, have certain limitations. And through those limitations, they act out the kind of limitations that the Greeks would have understood a man and his wife to work within. It's not important to them that Zeus be all three of these things simultaneously. It's important that Zeus incarnate the fact that, in most of ancient Greece, it was generally socially acceptable for a man to have sex with people who weren't just... But he couldn't do it with impunity. There was always some way for his wife to, be horrible and vindictive to his lovers/victims. And yet we have no difficulty understanding the incarnations of that particular way of seeing the world as gods. It seems natural. But the base case of this is not these two deities who have very specific histories, stories about them. Imagine two Heras. Two gods of the same divine domain, they're of the same thing, they're identical, but distinct. How do you know that there are more than one? If you have two Heras with the same powers and the same intentions, the same opportunities, the same motives, how do you know that you're dealing with two goddesses and not one? If in all situations they want to act similarly, and in all situations they can act similarly. This is why you can't have two gods of the same thing with no other factors. And there is a reason that the ancient Romans generally syncretized the new deities they encountered as they continued to expand their empire, encounter new peoples and new cultures. As my classics professor, or Roman Republic professor would have me believe, the general shared understanding among the polytheistic faiths of the ancient Mediterranean, who do not believe that their gods are region-locked, is that the gods that they worship, Hera, for example, Juno, in her Roman interpretation, let's go with the Roman example. Juno. Juno is not a distinct goddess from the goddess worshipped by their northern neighbors, the Etruscans, called Uni, or a distinct goddess from Hera in the Greek-speaking world. There's an understanding that Uni, Juno, and Hera are three words for the same fundamental divine being who is present all over the world. In the same way that like these three places might have different words for water, but it's not a fundamentally different substance in Greece or Etruria or in the city of Rome. One concept, culturally dependent names. So we have successfully ruled out the possibility that there might be two gods with equal power with identical divine domains. Now, let's assume these two gods have differing power levels. Let's assume that God A is somehow more powerful than God B. Hera A is more powerful, more authoritative than Hera B. If Hera A and Hera B both want something to happen, they'll make it happen. If strong Hera wants something to happen and weak Hera disagrees and strong Hera is just gonna completely overwhelm weak Hera, then whatever it is that strong Hera wants to go ahead will go ahead. God A's intentions are always carried through, either because she shares them with God B, or because she can overwhelm God B with superior force. Which again raises the question, how would you know you had a God A and a God B? If the same single set of intentions is carried through with the same degree of power every time, or even with different degrees of power, like assume that, Hera A and Hera B acting in concert are somehow more powerful than either of them acting them alone. Very Powerpuff Girls, very Sailor Moon. How would you know that this was a mark of two deities collaborating rather than a consequence of a single deity who is simply more invested in some topics than in other topics? You have no way of knowing. Naturally, if you come upon another people living in another place, speaking another language, who worship a god who appears to do exactly or more or less the same things as your god does, you assume that these are the same god. Because either the influence of your own personal god, your influence with Juno as a Roman, ends where Etruria starts, either geographically or personally. Etruscans living in Rome itself are under the purview of a completely different being to your own, who simply has more or less the same powers and more or less the same intentions. And remember, if you understand on a very profound level Juno to be real, literally real in the same way that the things that she represents are real and life-defining. Do you see a bird on the side of the river that's like duckish? It looks like the other ducks. It's swimming around in the jousting pool with the other male mallards, while the female mallards look on from a distance with... duck faces are always kind of inscrutable, I guess. And it doesn't look quite like the others, but it looks like mostly like all the others in that group. What are you going to assume? Are you going to assume it's some like fundamentally different type of being? Are you going to assume it's an alien from another planet that's improperly disguised itself as a duck? Or are you just going to assume it's a duck that looks kind of weird? If you go to another country and you come about something that like looks basically like a duck, are you going to assume it's basically a duck? Needless to say, in the case where one god is powerful and the other god is entirely powerless, say Harabi she can't do shit. She's just fucking dead jellyfish on the beach. If she can't do anything with any powers, can she be called a god? What would imply that, like, this, which cannot do anything on its own because vodka is shelf stable. That's why the smart consumer buys vodka, not wine. It is powerless in and of itself. Can you really call something like that a god? Can you call this a god?
Finally, if two gods have identical divine domains, identical power levels, and conflicting intentions, they'll cancel each other out and nothing will happen. The existence of the other effectively renders each one powerless. Every time nothing happens, it could be because two gods both tried to do opposite things at the same time.
So we ruled out the case in which, like, you might have two gods with the same power level in the same area being distinguishable as two deities. And we ruled out the case in which two gods with the same general divine domain but different power levels can be distinguished as deities. The only way that you could distinguish between God A and God B is if they have differing divine domains.
Because multiple gods have to be specialized to be distinguishable, each god has to be a god of something unique. In their own domain, they're supreme, but in every other god's domain, their power is limited.
So if you don't have to be any of these things, and there are gods who are none of the above, you know. Odin dies. There's a time when Odin won't exist because he'll be dead. There are things that Odin can't know because he's researching. You only research if you don't know. That's how you know if you're a champion, you don't research. Like I did for this video. And clearly he's not omnipotent, because if he could do anything, then he could survive. So what's not a god? So, reading off of Wikipedia here. Gravity has the power to pull things with mass together. The bigger the two things are, the more gravity can pull on them. The closer the two things are, the more gravity can pull on them. If you jump on the earth, you land on the earth, you do not fall into the sun. This is because the sun is made of gas and is therefore lighter. So gravity is a force that appears to exist at all times and all places within the known universe. Some people speculate that it may have been stronger or weaker at some point in the past. Its general strength may change with time. Maybe. And it can't do everything, but it does appear to be able to pull all things together. If they weigh anything, which things don't have to, things can weigh nothing, but gravity can pull on them anyway. Photons weigh nothing, light weighs nothing. Gravity can still pull on them. The more you know. I got a C in quantum physics. Does it know everything? Can you prove it doesn't? Because it seems to know when things have mass, or maybe it doesn't know that photons don't have mass, that's why it pulls on them, maybe we should tell it. But, you know, regardless of where something is, regardless of what it is, it seems to be able to tell, in the same way that my snowblower hates me, what has mass and how far apart it is from everything else that has mass, and can therefore act accordingly. Is it omnipresent? Apparently. We haven't found a place where it's not, which is close as you're gonna get with having to, like, prove shit, like, facts and logic. Is it omnipotent? Dunno. Maybe the things it does are just the things it wants to do, and maybe it's extremely consistent. How do we know that it can't do things that aren't just pull things together at a rate of force of gravity equals Sure. Yeah, it's in there. Definitely real number. Everybody knows that's a real number. It's always the same all times, all places. Don't worry about it. Times the mass of thing 1 like you, and the mass of thing 2 like Earth, divided by distance between 1 and 2 squared. Maybe it could do anything, but this is the only thing it wants to do. How would you know? As far as the ancient Greeks were concerned, Hera was real. Her temples are her houses, her statues are not her, but incarnations of her, the same way that your nail clippings are incarnations of you. And they know she herself exists because marriage exists. Intentional force behind marriage, as they understand it, must exist because marriage, as they understand it, exists. We see the effect. Naturally, there must be a certain cost. Now, there could be infinite gravities. Maybe every pair of 2 objects in the entire known universe is in fact pulled together by a completely distinct force. How would you know? So this is why we have 1 gravity. Now, obviously, you can very simply solve the problem that apparently things in the outer reaches of the galaxy appear to be pulled way more strongly than this would suggest towards the middle of the galaxy. Maybe there's just a lot of other heavier things that are just invisible. Maybe there's 2 gravities. Maybe there's infinite gravities. Maybe they, decide how much they feel like pulling on a particular way. Maybe the entire galaxy is just a very large fan, and that's why it appears to spin the way that it does. I'm not going to settle that debate here. I'm here to prove the existence of God. So we can't necessarily prove that gravity fails all of these 3. What fails any of these 3 requirements? And it's a hell of a lot more powerful than a lot of the gods that, at least ancient peoples and potentially modern peoples have understood. There's a general understanding that if you curse the name of one of the Pan-Hellenic deities, they would strike you down, because that was construed as an attempt to objectively defy them. I can do lots of things that objectively attempt to defy gravity. I won't succeed.
Which is more powerful, a god who can attack you after you do something they don't like, or a god who can constrain existence itself so that it's only possible to do what they like?
So it has the authority to sort of... There are just flakes of eyeliner just all over the table. Oh my god. So why is gravity not a god? You could say that gravity exists provable. You don't need to have faith in gravity for it to keep working. Right? And you might argue that faith is sort of inherent to the idea of a god as such. You could argue that. You'd be wrong. Because on the one hand, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but, people who subscribe to a given religion generally believe that their god exists in an objective fashion. Christians who believe that Jesus is going to come back in a day now, generally believe that the appearance of Jesus does not inherently contradict the idea that he's God, which is also inherent in the idea of his existence. If there was a guy named Jesus and he was a person who people saw and talked to, who also happened to be God, his existence is provable. His existence is identical with God's. If you believe both of those things, you believe the existence of God is, in fact, provable. So the fact that you can prove the existence of gravity does not mean that, gravity can't be a god. Which leads to part 2 of the faith test. If no one had faith in God, would God exist?
In most theistic cosmologies, the god or the gods existed before religion was invented.
If your god created humanity, your god existed before humanity. There are a lot of gods and a lot of cultures all over the world who create humanity expressly so that there will be someone to worship them. Worship is an emergent effect from the presence of a god, and it is not what makes a god. I mean, obviously, if you don't believe that there are any gods, and naturally, it's simple to say that a god is anything that is worshipped, which then leads you into a discussion of what exactly qualifies as worship. And you can argue that people worship things that aren't necessarily gods at all. Let's say I pay a pop culture pagan to worship gravity as a god. We accept the pop cultural understanding of gravity as like a single force, and I go on Etsy or wherever the fuck, and I tell someone, like, hey, are you a pop culture pagan? Do you feel like adding a new artist to your rotation? Worship gravity. I'll give you $10, $20 to build a shrine to the abstract concept of gravity. Does that make gravity a god? You could say it's insincere, but again, I'm a descendant of people who were buried in the sand up to their necks and given until nightfall to accept Jesus Christ as their own personal Lord and Savior. Otherwise, they would be drowned. How many people in history have been sincerely religious in the way that we, in this particular day and age, would understand sincerity? We can't say that everyone who worshipped Hera in any way, shape, or form didn't, in their heart of hearts, believe she wasn't real. I mean, we don't have the evidence to suggest it either way. We do have evidence from sort of more educated facts and logic-y Romans that they didn't believe in the sort of poetic tradition of their own religion. The stories that we believe to be Roman religion, they did not believe were true in any sense. They were just something for those the uneducated masses to believe. One of my favorite, Marcus Aurelius has some banger quotes, but one of my favorites is when he gets going on. Poor people think when you die, your soul goes in the ground. Facts and logic educated people like me know that when you die, your soul goes in the air, where it soul decomposes to make space for all the other souls that are also going to go into the air, because otherwise you would run out of space. If every dead person had to go in the dirt, what would happen when there was no more space in the dirt? Obviously you have to soul decompose. And where else would you soul decompose but in the air? It's just logic, people. That's one of my favorite examples of like pseudo proto-rationality, coexisting with religious sentiment. With a fundamentally religious worldview, he doesn't question the existence of the soul. He doesn't question the idea that the soul goes somewhere else after you die, after your physical body dies. And that way, early Christianity was more radical, because I honestly believe that the early sources indicate that, we generally believe that when your body dies, so does your soul. Your soul is your body. Whoever it was that buried my distant ancestors up to their necks in the sand and told them they had until the tide come in to become Christians, that person believed that would work. Sincerity is unrelated. If that person is motivated by the sincere belief that those people will burn in hell eternally, regardless of how long they live, if they die without accepting Jesus, it doesn't really matter how they die, including if they die because you buried them up to their necks in the sand and gave them until the tide came in to profess their belief in Jesus Christ. That person believed that the fear of death that one of these unrepentant pagans might have had was just as good as the fear that they themselves had that that person would die. They're converting people on this sort of accelerated time scale as opposed to trying to talk to them, because if you try to talk to gradually integrate yourself into their community, if they die tomorrow, unsaved, you have no one to blame but yourself. So you gotta get it done up front. And your fear of their death is just as good as their fear of their own death. We understand belief in a fundamentally enlightenment concept. And belief is an opt-in. Belief is something separate from my belief in my table. I don't believe in my table. My table is just there. If I don't believe in my table, that's what I'm leaning on. It's a table. I'm objectively wrong in a way that I can't be objectively wrong if I objectively don't believe in God. These are two fundamentally separate categories of things. That's fundamentally an Enlightenment idea. That's not a distinction that most people throughout human history appear to have made.
We can't know that for sure. Regardless, we call some ideas that belong to other cultures, including cultures that have no living members, the gods of that culture. We don't verify or reconstruct their ideas about what counts as belief or faith before we start talking about their gods. If anything, we build our working understanding of what belief and faith meant or mean to that culture's people by starting with their gods and working outwards, not vice versa.
Obviously, to our question of what's not a god, we can apply the intent test. We can say gravity is intentionless. We can say that the forces of nature that ancient gods were meant to incarnate are also intentionless. Plants grow in the spring, no one wills it to be as simply as. Social institutions such as marriage and host-guest relations exist, but not because a particular singular being all will them to exist. They're social constructs.
The idea that only human beings can form and act on conscious intentions is an outgrowth of the Christian idea that only human beings have free will because only human beings are created in the image of God. If humans can freely form and act on intentions, there's no inherent reason to assume that we're alone in that. And if nothing non-human can freely form or act on an intention at all, there's no inherent reason to believe that we can either. If reality was deterministic for these several billion years that it took for the Earth to form and our species to evolve, there's no reason to assume that it isn't anymore.
The deterministic view of the world, of what goes on in it, of why the things happen that happen even among human beings, which are conscious and are intentional in the same way that we have, historically understood our gods to be conscious and intentional because we have modeled our gods on ourselves. Very overt in something like the Abrahamic religions that understand humanity to be created in the image of God. It's sort of transparent to anyone who looks at an ancient mythos. They see the gods as a sort of diorama that acts out the dramas of human life. Suppose the world is intentionless. Suppose only human beings are capable of forming intentions and acting on them. Suppose even human beings don't necessarily form intentions, as there is like a singular process that has rippled outwards from the Big Bang and has resulted in people like me believing that they intend, but really it's one step in a chain reaction, stepping back to the very first moment that anything existed and stepping forward inexorably towards the final moment at which anything would. Perhaps there isn't a single predetermined progression, but perhaps everything is determined by purely probabilistic quantum mechanics, and you reject that stupid-ass theory that, to have a free will and a soul is to be able to decide which way a quantum bit will flip. That's stupid. That's some first draft shit, and I can't believe we even had to debunk it in Philosophy 101, but anyway.
The idea of gods doing something they don't intend, making mistakes, is uncomfortable for most modern monotheists, especially when we find it in our own holy books. Did God call down the Great Flood because he thought humanity was a mistake? Did he promise not to do it again because he thought the flood was a mistake? Regardless, in other traditions, gods do things they don't intend to do all the time. Every earthquake is one of Loki's involuntary convulsions. That said, I can't think of a single example of a being who never has any intentions being considered a god. The determinism argument is a complete red herring. Intention describes the subjective experience of predicting the consequences of an action and then doing it or not doing it based on that prediction. We have this experience all the time, so do our gods. When we theorize a being that doesn't have that experience, we don't call it a god. The Tao intends nothing, the Tao is not a god. And now we finally have a criterion for what isn't a god. Something that has no intentions can't be a god.
She can dance. She can dance. The time, my God, so precious. Now, I have a friend who's an atheist, and when he talks about what he means by that, because, there's a very, very broad range of people who could fall under that umbrella. When he talks about what he means by that, he describes it in terms of not believing in any transcendence, not believing in a transcendent power, not believing in a transcendent being categorically opposed to the idea of transcendence in and of itself. So am I. What is transcendence? Is it something that exists outside reality? If it exists outside reality, how can it exist? The only way you can define transcendence, as in, is to define it as what isn't. It isn't anything that we would recognize as a part of normal reality, okay? That's anything I can imagine, but that I can't see in real life. Or see real life being, my senses. Those things that I generally accept to be true, even though I haven't seen them. There are some kinds of animals that I can't see, for example, but if they have Wikipedia articles, I'm inclined to believe that they exist regardless of my own empirical experience. Strict empiricists are the most annoying fucking people. If anything transcendent is something that doesn't belong to typical reality. Before today, I hadn't seen this particular package of Superflex straws. So you could argue that that thing is like fundamentally unusual in my general experience of reality. Few people would argue that my 75 pack of Superflex straws is transcendent in some way. I wouldn't be one of them, obviously. There's something fundamentally transcendent about just how many times you can bend them. But something can't be transcendent just because it's unusual. Lots of things are unusual. We have a word for transcendent because it's entirely distinct from the idea of the sort of normal phenomena that only happen abnormally. Even if you include the definition of things that don't appear to follow what we would consider to be sort of rational materialistic logic, if we include things like magic, for example, magic is transcendent. Magic obeys rules that are entirely divorced from the sort of physical rules that mere mortals seem to follow in our day-to-day life. But magic isn't God. It can be connected with God. It's, in most forms, connected with some form of worship, but it's understood to be distinct. So, clearly God isn't just anything that transcends reality. The fundamental question of transcendence in general is like, what? If you've transcended reality, if you've transcended this world, what is there to transcend to, if not more reality? The only way people can explain the existence of things that transcend this particular reality is to say that they are real. Heaven is for real. I had to watch that in Sunday school class. It's a terrible movie. The only way that we can really conceptualize the idea of these things existing in the same way that some people believe the rapture definitely exists is to say that they do exist. They are part of reality as we empirically experience it. They are real in the way that this is real. This and the Lord exist on the same level of reality. I can buy a red wine. Nobody ever does communion with white wine, rosé. Oh, they should. I can go to the Bacon Sage liquor department. I can pick up some 100% premium grade Jesus if I just do the right ritual, if I just say the right words. Fundamentally, what is the difference between wine that is Jesus and my vodka? It's platinum. You can't tell, but it's true. I wouldn't lie to you. There's a fundamental logical contradiction at the heart of the idea of transcendence. Because what can you transcend to, if not more reality? If you can't transcend anything, if there's nothing more real in reality, then naturally it's not real. You understand this trap of needing to explain things beyond reality in terms of whether they're real or not real. There's no release from the strict binary of things that are versus are not real. Could there be? But if you came across records of some culture or across some living person who believed that their gods were part of reality in the same way that things that you can empirically, or maybe things that you can't empirically understand with your own senses. But I believe that there are wavelengths of light that I can't see with my human eye. But I believe that they're real in the same way that the wavelengths that I can see are real. So it's natural to believe there might be beings that are real in the same way that the people around me are real, that I simply can't perceive in the same way that I perceive the people who are around me. And naturally, if I understand my gods to be the forces that animate, the forces that cause everything that I encounter empirically to exist, And that without those gods, those things would stop existing. That those gods are both necessary and sufficient for the existence of my empirical reality. Naturally, everything in my empirical reality is proof of the existence of my gods, because my definition of God is that which causes my world to exist. There is nothing that I can perceive that was not put there by a divine force. So fundamentally, like, if you decide that God is something that does exist, then God exists, and if you decide that God is something that doesn't exist, then God doesn't exist. That's boring. Why pay for an iPhone that's gonna like steadily lower your battery life over time if you could just pay for a Motorola that has shit battery life to start and then just continues having shit battery life for the rest of its earthly career? So that leaves us kind of an impasse, isn't it? Have we just decided that a god is anything that anyone believes is a god, and what is not a god is anything that anyone believes is not a god? If you believe that God is real, then you can easily believe that real things in the empirical sense of the word can be proof of God. However, if you believe that God is not real, then you do not believe that anything that is non-negotiably a part of your own personal reality can be proof of God. You understand the problem. But at the end of the day, we're all using the word God. What do all of us have in common? What do we mean as a group? Because the meaning of a word, of course, to some extent, is contingent by the ideas that you hold about the thing you're referring to. But the point of a word is to transcend those limitations, to transcend the limits of like what personally something might mean to me. To me, Milwaukee, home. To you, Milwaukee, where? In the 3 separate languages that the Milwaukee Art Museum has informed me have, distinct meanings of the word Milwaukee, it means, in one language, good land, the good land. In another one, some misfortune happens. Can't deny that. In another one, bad lake. One city. Many, many ideas. But the idea of simply giving it a name is to be able to communicate the concept of the thing that exists in the shared reality that we all inhabit among these groups of people who might have different associations with the word, with even the place, with even their conception of the objective reality. Because someone who was living in the city of Milwaukee 100 years ago has a very different idea of what it looks like to me, to the idea that someone might have 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. But as long as we've been calling it by a single word, and as long as we've encountered other people who have called this physical location by a different name, we've understood their name to be another word for this concept that we all share. What is this concept of God? What is this idea that we're willing to accept? Why do we know what someone else means when they use this word? A god can be in some places but not other places. We've established that. We have shown that a god need not be omniscient, and a god need not be omnipotent, because there can be more than one.
I am an intentional being.
I'm not omnipresent, but I am present in some location. And you can be a god who isn't omnipresent. You just need to be present somewhere in order to be a god. If you're nowhere, then what kind of stupid god? Not even worth it. I'm not omniscient. I know some things, I don't know other things. If I want to know something, I need to find out, much like Odin himself. And I'm not omnipotent, but there are some things I can do and there are some things I can't do. There are some things that I will be prevented from doing by forces far larger than me, far beyond my control. And there are some things I can be stopped from doing by other people. Maybe. But none of these things actually disqualify me, personally, from being a god.